Hello, my name is Paul Anderson. I'm a pastor at Grace Valley Fellowship here in Phoenixville. Thanks for joining us today. When I was in my kind of early 20s, I had this crushing pain in my chest, the kind of thing that would just stop me in my tracks, and didn't know what it was. Kept reoccurring, and I'm usually the doctor avoidant type, so I kind of just ignored it until a nurse friend of mine said, that's the type of pain that might signal something really wrong with your heart. You need to go to the doctor, get it checked out. So I finally decided, okay, I'll go get it checked out. I go to the doctor, and he straps me up to one of those EKG machines and checks out my heart. And then I'm sitting there on the crinkly paper, in the exam room, and putting my shirt back on. The doctor walks in with the report, and he looks at me and says, well, you have nothing wrong with your heart. You have the heart of an endurance athlete. At the time, I was running long distances. And he said, whatever's wrong with you, it isn't physical. And that for me was a new thought. This idea that I could have this physical crushing pain, like in my chest, something that would literally stop me in my tracks, that was not physical, that it was something in my head, it was in my heart, but not my physical heart, more like in my soul, that was actually causing this pain. It was a new thought. I didn't quite know what to do with it. And that started me on a long journey of uncovering anxieties, fears, worries in my heart, and figuring out what to do with those. And over the years, now 20 years into this journey, I've come to see that the only times I've made real progress in life are when someone or something has entered in my life and acted as a guide, showed me, hey, here's the next step you need to take, or here's how to identify your worries, here's how to deal with them, here's how to deal with what's going on underneath the surface. And that's what we hope today is for you. You may not personally struggle with anxiety, yet statistically speaking, you or someone close to you does. Millions, tens of millions of Americans have a reoccurring struggle with anxiety, some on the order of having serious anxiety disorders. And I can only imagine how that's being impacted and affected by this pandemic going on right now. So today, we get the chance to sit down with counselor Dave Wiedis and talk through practical steps of handling fear and anxiety. Dave has guided many people on their journey of uncovering and dealing with, addressing these issues of fear and anxiety. So whether this is something you need to hear right now, or whether this is something you need to tuck away because you need to help others with this information, I just want to encourage you today to pay close attention. His advice is tried and true. He's helped hundreds and hundreds of people. So a couple of notes before we dive into the interview today. First, I want to acknowledge that we're all in different places in our relationship with God here, and that's okay. So Dave and I, we are both followers of Jesus, and we are going to talk openly about the Scriptures, about our belief in Jesus, and we're going to assume that. But if you're not there yet, that's okay. His advice is not meant to be exclusive. It is practical, it is tried and true, it's tested advice. I'm certain that wherever you're at in your faith journey, you will find it helpful. Please just follow along, sift through what's helpful for you. Second, our conversation is largely based upon a two-part series that Dave did a while back called Handling Fear and Anxiety. So this conversation doesn't assume that you've watched these, but it's well worth your time to watch. You'll find the links in the notes below. And then finally, I realize that there's this irony here. Talking about anxiety can become a trigger for anxiety. So I say that to just give you a gentle warning or an encouragement to pay attention to what's going on in you right now. We really don't want to cause any anxiety attacks or make things worse for you. If this is not the time or the place for you, if you're not ready to listen to this, please press pause. You can come back to this later. Pay attention to your response to this. And with that, let's get to this interview. So I'm here today with Dave Wiedis. Dave, you are a attorney turned counselor, is that correct?
That's right, I'm a recovering attorney.
Yeah, so
I call myself and then turned counselor, that's right.
So you've seen all kinds of human depravity at this point.
Including my own.
Yeah, very good. So I wanted to get right to it today. Super excited to have you with us.
Yeah.
In normal times, anxiety is pervasive. As you say in one of your talks, you mentioned that there are more than 50 million adults in the U.S. who are affected by reoccurring anxiety, and you suggest that it's probably even higher among teens percentage-wise.
It's really one of the most common maladies that we all face.
And I can only imagine how this pandemic's affecting that.
Right.
And affecting all of us.
Sure.
Upsetting our lives in major ways. So in your message, you give a really practical definition that I wanted to just lay out there as a starting point for this conversation. You define anxiety, for those of us who are not trained in counseling, you define it this way. You say, anxiety occurs when I import my imagination of a future event into the present, and my mind and my body experience and respond to it as if it's happening now.
Right.
So could you maybe unpack this for us
Sure.
a little bit and give us some examples of...
Sure. If you think about anxiety, it's an emotional reaction to what? Not an event, but my imagination of an event. So if I'm thinking, for example, of something in the future that's going to happen, like I'm going to go to a meeting, or I'm going to be interviewed, or I'm going to preach, these are events that, depending on how I think about them, are going to create anxiety or not. So my imagination of going to a meeting where things go wrong creates, and I import my imagination of a future into the present. My body and my mind responds as if it's happening right now. So it's a practical example or practical definition of how anxiety takes place.
So let's work with this a little more. You used a specific word called catastrophizing,
Right.
To describe what we do when we get caught up in this. When anxiety specifically directs our thinking and emotional response to a situation. So could you maybe illustrate
Sure.
or describe this a little
Sure.
more?
When I say catastrophizing, we're talking about thinking the worst case scenario. So I'm imagining I'm going on a ski trip, right? And that's supposed to get me excited. But suppose I'm inclined toward anxiety, and so suppose I start to think, well, if I'm on that ski trip, what happens if the lift shuts down while I'm up there and it's negative 20 degrees? That's imagining, and it's also catastrophizing. It's thinking about the worst case scenario. Maybe a worst case scenario would be, what if I break my leg and I'm stranded and nobody finds me, right? So people who worry tend to worry in excess, and the more you worry, it sort of worry begets worry. And so if you're used to worrying and you're used to thinking in that kind of logic or that category, you tend to think about the worst case scenarios. I don't dream about, oh, it's going to be great, and get anxious. I go, what could go wrong? I'm going to this meeting. What could go wrong? So that's what I mean by catastrophizing. It's sort of the worst case of the imagination that you can come up with. And that's what sparks a lot of anxiety.
So put this together a bit for us. So defining anxiety as, our imagination, but we're experiencing it as if it's happening right now, and then catastrophizing is the worst case scenario.
Right.
So what is it? What are signs or symptoms that we might be experiencing the worst case scenario or this type of anxiety right now?
Right.
Like physically, emotionally, relationally.
For me personally, I'll start to get flutters in my stomach. I'll start to feel this diffuse sort of stuff in my chest. And some of the symptoms of anxiety can be anything from, stomach ache, butterflies in the stomach. You can start to sweat. You can start to not think clearly. Anxiety can impede our thought process. We can get heart palpitations. We can start to breathe faster. It all depends on how it goes, right? And I'll give you a quick example that I use in the talk in the sermon, but it's an apropos example. I was gifted a free trip on a beautiful, beautiful something called the Sea Cloud. And my wife and I were going to go for free in this luxurious thing to go on the voyages of St. Paul. And now I'm sitting there planning how to fly home after that trip. And as I'm doing it, I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, There's riots going on in Turkey right now. I'm supposed to fly out of Istanbul. What happens if I get caught in a riot? What happens if terrorists board the ship that I'm on in the Aegean Sea, right? That's starting to imagine and catastrophize at the same time. So instead of like normal people saying, wow, we got this free trip, this is going to be great, I'm catastrophizing and feeling all kinds of anxiety in my chest, in my stomach, in my heart, you know, and that's how that all works together.
I mean, the more you talk about those symptoms, the more I actually feel it.
Yeah.
Just mentioning that. So in my experience, I've definitely had the physiological response, the tightening in the chest, difficulty breathing, tingling sensations, things like that from anxiety. But you specifically point to or emphasize the fact that anxiety does not arise just from external circumstances or emotional responses, but it's really, you point to an underlying thoughts and beliefs.
Right.
So can you take a moment to unpack this? Like why, if I'm struggling with anxiety, why you think it's helpful to look under the surface at our thoughts and beliefs?
You want to go to the root and not the fruit. In other words, the physical manifestations of anxiety can be things that we've talked about: heart beating fast, shallow breathing, sweaty palms, that kind of thing. That's just the manifestation of anxiety. So I don't want to just manage symptoms like that. I want to go to the root. What's the root? Typically, not always, but typically the root is what I'm thinking and what I'm believing. It's my beliefs that can fuel anxiety, not the reality of a situation. So for example, if you and I believed right here now that there was going to be an earthquake where we're taping this, right? We would, and we genuinely believed it, our bodies would respond as if we're in danger. Now, it might be that there's not been an earthquake here for 200 years and there won't be for 1,000 years, but that might be the truth, but our thoughts and the meaning we make of experience is really what fuels anxiety. So sometimes psychologists would say, anxiety is really a disorder of our thoughts, or it's a misattribution of what's really happening. So take a circumstance that could be stressful, like losing your job or being diagnosed with an illness, right? It's not the losing the job, it's what meaning I make of losing the job or the meaning I make of illness that really fuels fear and anxiety and even depression. So it works in conjunction with depression too. If I have depressive thoughts, my body will respond and my emotions will respond as if it's happening as well.
Just personally speaking, it's often difficult to separate my experience of something from recognizing the thought from my experience of it. Do you have any helpful advice on how to make that differentiation? Because it might just be a story I'm telling myself or something I believe about it but it doesn't feel that way.
That's right, and you just said something really important. It's the story we tell ourselves. It's our narrative in our head. It's the beliefs, not the event. If you think about when Jesus was on the boat and he was asleep and there was a storm, it wasn't the storm that caused the disciples to be so afraid. It was their belief that Jesus didn't care and that he's asleep while the waves are crashing over the side. But it's easy to mistake that it's the circumstance. So I give an example, and I want you to think about an acronym, A, B, C. A means an activating event, some kind of event that takes place. C is a consequence, the emotion, fear, or anxiety. Most of us think, okay, I'm in a circumstance that causes me to have fear. Well, it's not the circumstance, it's the belief underlying the circumstance. For example, I walk into a room, people are laughing, and I get embarrassed. Why was I embarrassed? Was it because people were laughing? No. It was because I believed that they were laughing at me. And that's a key distinction. So most of us try to change our circumstances or think, oh, my circumstances is what's causing me to have anxiety. No, it's the beliefs that you have underlying the circumstance. And so the key is to identify the beliefs and start to think, what is it true? Are there other reasons why people could be laughing when I walk into a room? Maybe somebody just told a joke that was really funny. They didn't even notice me. Think about the kind of thought, for example, we're going to broadcast this. We hope people will watch it. Suppose I find out that 3 people watch this interview. Will that cause me to be sad or anxious? It won't be that. It would be what I tell myself. What's the story I tell myself? Well, you weren't any good. This wasn't any good. Nobody cares. Those are beliefs. So the circumstance isn't what causes the anxiety. It's the belief underlying the circumstance.
So I've heard you before kind of point out some of the main stories that we tell ourselves that create this type of anxiety in us. What are some of the types or maybe some examples of stories we tell ourselves that create that in us?
We might have a sentence in our head that says, I'm no good. I'm not competent. No one loves me. It will not go well. For me, when I think of any opportunity that I have, typically, my mind doesn't go to the positive, it goes to the negative. And the negative story might be, you're going to mess up. You're not going to know what to say in this circumstance. People won't think you're competent. Those are the kind of stories that sort of go through my head. And these are called automatic thoughts. An automatic thought is something that sort of pops into your head, and there's usually a theme to it, like the ones I just said. And these automatic thoughts come up, and they're called automatic because they sort of pop up, and sometimes you're not even aware that you have them. And so what's really important for people to do is that ABC, activating event and consequence, to start to look at the belief or the thought underlying the emotion. I think, Paul, another really important point that people need to understand is thoughts and beliefs precede emotion. Many of us think about emotion just coming up. It's spontaneous. I'm just feeling this way. I don't know why, but I am. But always a thought will precede the emotion. So if I'm feeling anxious, what I want to start to do is go, let me slow down and let me think about, what am I thinking? What thought occurred to me? Just like when I was trying to schedule my flight home from Istanbul, what thought occurred to me? I'm getting caught in a riot. Now, sometimes those thoughts are not thoughts. Some people think in pictures. My wife, she's an artist. She thinks in cartoons. So it might be an image that pops up, an image of a stern person or someone yelling at you, or the riot in Istanbul, right? And so we have to be really careful and really thoughtful about our thoughts. And the question is, am I rooted and grounded in truth, or am I rooted and grounded in some fantasy of my imagination of some future event that I'm going to bring into the future into the present right now, and act as if it's happening?
So I know for me, it took me years to kind of get to this point, but I've come to the place of self-awareness that my story, the story I tend to tell myself that leads me in the wrong way, is that I'm not good enough. And that's taken help and figuring out and life lessons along the way to get to that point, to recognize that and to be able to confront that. If we could go back 10 years and talk to me, or talk to someone who's listening in today,
who has that narrative,
has a narrative, and they maybe haven't even identified it yet, or they're just begun to identify it, would you have any specific advice for them on like how to maybe begin to recognize it or begin to combat it, even if they know it's a lie?
Sure. I think one of the things that you want to ask yourself is, whose voice is that? Whose voice is in your head that says you're no good or you're not good enough? And where did it come from? And the key question is it true? Key question is it grounded in biblical truth? And is it grounded in the circumstance, right? So you start to wonder and ask yourself, get curious about this, as opposed to just condemning yourself. I mean, I've had similar narratives like, you're no good, you're not smart. These kind of narratives keep coming up. And by the way, when you have a narrative, it doesn't matter what the actual evidence is. That narrative will stay with you unless you intentionally go after it. So for you, 10 years ago, had you been able to say, hey, this is a narrative in my head, and is this narrative really true? Where did it come from? And if it's not true, what is true? And that's really the key thing, is what's really true. And by the way, one question I would say is, good enough for what? What's the standard of good enough? Now, there's one place where that might be true, and the gospel applies, right? We're not good enough on our own standing before God, which is why God provides his son and the sacrifice for us to be good enough. But given the fact that he has provided his son for us, we can stand before the throne of God and plead with him and know him and have intimate relationship with him.
So one of my favorite stories, and now knowing my own story, you'll see why this resonates so deeply. One of my favorite stories is about the reformer Martin Luther, and he says he was in his cell where he lived, and Satan would come to him and tempt him and say, "You're not good enough. You don't deserve to be a minister. You don't deserve to be called Christian." And his response was, "You're right.
Right.
But Jesus Christ is my righteousness."
Exactly.
And that's the freedom of grace.
It is.
And that's why it resonates so deeply with me. I know other people have different stories or automatic thoughts that they struggle with, though. So let's move this forward a little beyond just dealing with self-awareness to actually helping others.
Sure.
As a follower of Christ, both of us are followers of Christ, and now you're a professional counselor. What advice would you give to those who want to use the scriptures or other Christians or other people to come alongside? They want to help those who are struggling with anxiety, even if they might not be themselves. What are some helpful boundaries and ways that they can help without hurting specifically?
That's a great question. It's a difficult question. I think first of all, we always need to be mindful of ourselves and what our motives are and why we're trying to help someone. And as we help people, as you said, we want to help and not hurt. So I think a great approach with people with anxiety is, number one, know yourself and know what your own triggers are. Number two, what is it that people need when they're feeling anxious? A lot of times we think we can reason them out of it, or scold them out of it, or smack them in the head with a Bible verse out of it. And those things are really not helpful at all.
Yeah.
So most of the time, people who are suffering from anxiety need assurance, they need security, they need calmness, and they need you to be able to understand and not get ignited or triggered by them. And that's really hard sometimes. Like if you ever notice when you're around someone who's anxious, it's pretty infectious. You start to get anxious when you're around somebody who's anxious.
Yeah.
You might start to talk fast when they talk fast. And so you might want to just slow it down and just become aware of what's happening. And then really try to empathize and try to understand what's happening for that person, what they're feeling.
Helpful. So I shouldn't preach more loudly and command them to be anxious for nothing, okay?
There you go. Just heap that guilt, heap that guilt on them.
So getting just really practical, you gave in one of your messages on moving from anxiety to rest, you give this acronym that I thought was super helpful. It was REST. And the keywords were redirecting our thoughts towards truth, recognizing the emotion, E, practicing Sabbath or a rest, and then T, talking to others, talking to God specifically. Would you maybe kind of walk us through these steps and how maybe we could,
Sure.
What's a beginning to implement that type of format for ourselves?
Yeah, the acronym REST can be, I used it as a actual sermon outline, but I also use it as a practice. So let's just define the terms for a moment, right? So the R stands for redirecting our thoughts to the truth. The truth of God's Word and who He is and who He says I am, so biblical truth, and also truth of the circumstances that we're in, and asking yourself, what is true? So, for example, with the disciples, when they thought Jesus didn't care in the boat, the way to redirect the truth to the truth would be, hey, God is in control and God cares for us. So I think it's helpful sometimes to preach the gospel to ourselves. Part of Serving Leaders Ministries is we counsel lots of pastors. You'd be surprised how many pastors can preach the gospel to others, but really don't incorporate it inside to themselves. And so what's important, and we all need that. We all need to really understand the gospel. So, for example, can I rest in the fact that God loves me? He lavishes His love on me. He cares for me. And I don't mean to sound this in a egocentric way, but think about what Scripture tells us. He chose us in Him before the foundation of the world. Okay, what does that mean? That means God chose us without us doing anything. So He loves us. He's chosen us, and He wants good for us, and He will do good for us. So that's what I mean by redirecting thoughts to biblical truth, and then the truth of a circumstance. What is really happening here? So if I am going to be giving a speech or doing something that makes me anxious, can I stay grounded in the truth? What's the truth? And what's the truth, for example, of the narrative that I say, oh, it won't go well, or you're not smart? What's the real truth there? And do I have any evidence to prove that my false beliefs are true? Right? So redirecting my thoughts, first and foremost, to the truth of God's Word and the truth of the circumstance. That's R. E is emotion. Now, think about emotion and the word emotion. A lot of Christians have a real allergic reaction to the word emotion because they think, oh, emotions, they're bad. I shouldn't feel this. I shouldn't feel that. Well, where did we get that? Where did we get that idea? Emotions are one of the ways God's created us and made us. He made us with emotion, and all you need to do is read through the Psalms or read through how Jesus responded to Lazarus' death to see that the psalmist was honest with God about his emotional state. He didn't hide it. He didn't say, I shouldn't be sad, or I shouldn't want vengeance on my enemies. He was honest with himself first and foremost. He was honest with God. And I think as Christians, many times we have this misconception that I shouldn't be honest because I shouldn't be angry. I shouldn't be sad.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a biblical idea.
Yeah.
Now, we don't let our emotions control us, but I think we've gone way overboard by basically denying unpleasant emotions. It's really important to be able to acknowledge emotions. So in the acronym REST, the E is, what am I feeling right now? So I redirect my thoughts, what am I thinking? And then what am I feeling? Okay, I'm feeling anxious inside. My stomach is like in knots. I've got a headache. My shoulders are tense. Acknowledging what you feel and being able to be grounded in the present is really, really important. So that's R and E. Then S, Sabbath. If I was doing that again, I would rename it to self-care, because Sabbath indicates, people think, 24-hour period. Well,
yeah.
Self-care, being conscious of how am I taking care of myself? Am I taking care of myself? What's my capacity right now to handle anxiety? And giving myself a break. Because, for example, in a busy season, and we're going strong, and we're not eating well, we're not sleeping well, we're not resting, we don't have balance, that can create extra strength and lower our capacity to deal with anxiety. I know when I'm anxious, my wife asks me to do something, I can't handle it, right? So there's too much going on. So at least I can say, all right, what am I feeling here in terms of the emotions? And how am I taking care of myself?
I had a professor who used to say students would come to him ready to drop out of school, and his first question he would always ask them is, how much sleep are you getting?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not to underestimate sleep. There's a great book out called Why We Sleep. It shows you the physiological need for sleep, and it's amazing how God has made us and wired us to sleep. We need 8 hours of sleep. So anyway, that's the S, self-care Sabbath. And then T, talking. Talking with God, prayer, and talking with others. I think a lot of us who experience anxiety tend to isolate. Some of us are ashamed of it. We're embarrassed. We don't want to let other people know. I have always found it very helpful to be able to talk, to be honest with God. Say, God, I feel anxious right now. I know it might not seem rational. I don't feel like I'm trusting you. I know I ought to trust you. Lord, could you be with me in this? And then also talking to other people. People, whether it's a counselor, whether it's a good friend, whether it's a family member. I think it's helpful sometimes to really talk through. And sometimes, if your experience is like mine, when I think and I'm in my head, it all gets jumbled up. And it's really hard to sort it out. But when I start to talk about it, things assume their right place, and I go, oh, that's not as bad as I thought. It's a little bit like a jumble of yarn. You want to take out one string at a time. So what am I anxious about? Can I talk about this? Yeah, I'm really thinking that when I go on this trip, something bad's going to happen. Can we talk about this? And so that's the acronym. And the acronym REST is designed to actually, if you practice doing that, systematically going through, you can do it in 3 minutes, you can do it in 15 minutes. And so in the sermon series, which I would encourage people to really watch, I actually demonstrate it because I was anticipating a trip to India, which was getting me stressed. So I actually, during my sermon, I said, let me demonstrate how REST can work and function. I just walk through the elements and help people understand that. But it's a really good practice.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining us today. And this is just, the timing could not be better or worse. I'm not sure which you would say it, but it's both. In this pandemic, we had scheduled this months ahead before we even knew of a pandemic, but it is really God's providence that we're having this discussion now in the midst of so much fear and anxiety. So
thanks for having me, Paul. And I'd like to say to your church, I wish I could have been present with you in person, because I was really looking forward to meeting your church and the people there and just interacting.
Well, we'll have to find another time.
Okay, great.
That'd be good.
Thanks so much for having me.
So to everyone out there listening today, thank you so much for joining us. A couple practical notes as we close out. First, if you haven't checked out Dave's 2-part series on handling anxiety, you'll find the link to that and more resources, additional resources in the notes below. Also, just wanted to mention that if you do have an anxiety disorder, my heart goes out to you. And we do not mean this to be to overstep any bounds here. This is not medical advice. You should go to your counselor. You should listen to your doctor at this time. If you do need a counselor or psychologist, we have, again, links below that you can follow to reach out either to our church to help point you in the right direction or to Serving Leaders Ministry. Finally, if you're free next Sunday, we are going to be picking back up in the Gospel of John. I want to invite you to join us right back here, same time. We're going to be talking about Jesus' claim that he alone can satisfy our deepest hunger. So until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Keep safe and sane, and go in peace.